The CEO laughed when she saw the old $10 watch on the wrist of a single father who worked as a maintenance man. In front of executives, investors, and an entire boardroom, she picked it up, called it worthless, and hurled it across the room until it shattered into pieces. What she didn't know was that the worn-out watch carried a secret hidden for more than 3 decades, a secret tied to the very foundation of her billion-dollar empire. And just days later, the most powerful man in the company, the chairman himself, would do something no one thought possible. In front of hundreds of employees, he would fall to his knees and beg the single father for forgiveness. The reason why would leave the entire room speechless. On a cold Monday morning, Daniel Carter stood in the employee parking lot of Ashton Global, staring at the massive glass headquarters that seemed to rise endlessly into the sky. At 58 years old, he had spent nearly 20 years working for the company as a maintenance technician, yet every day he still entered through the same service entrance, while executives arrived through grand marble lobbies. His aging pickup truck rattled as he turned off the engine, drawing little attention among the luxury vehicles surrounding it. Daniel didn't mind. That truck had carried him through the darkest years of his life. 12 years earlier, after losing his wife Mary to a long illness, he had been left alone to raise their daughter Emily. There had been nights when he worked double shifts, skipped meals, and slept only a few hours just to make sure Emily had everything she needed. Every sacrifice had been worth it. Emily had recently graduated from college and was beginning to build a promising future. Before walking into the building, Daniel glanced down at the old watch resting on his wrist. The leather strap was cracked from decades of use. The glass was scratched. The silver casing had faded long ago. Most people would have thrown it away years earlier, but Daniel carefully ran his thumb across the worn surface. It was the last gift Mary had ever given him. She had placed it in his hand on the day Emily was born, and smiled as she whispered, "No matter how difficult life becomes, keep moving forward and keep this watch with you." Since that day, Daniel had never taken it off. Not once. Inside Ashton Global, the atmosphere felt unusually tense. Employees hurried through the corridors carrying folders and tablets. Managers rushed between meetings. Investors from around the country were arriving for one of the company's most important board meetings of the year. Even maintenance staff had been instructed to avoid the executive floors unless absolutely necessary. Daniel spent the morning repairing a lighting system in one of the lower offices when his supervisor suddenly approached him carrying a stack of documents. "Daniel, I need a favor," the supervisor said. Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and looked up. "What is it?" The supervisor handed him the folders. "These maintenance records need to be delivered to the executive conference room immediately. The assistant responsible for them is stuck in traffic." Daniel hesitated. He had never been on the executive floor before. "You want me to take them upstairs?" The supervisor nodded. "Just drop them off and leave. It'll only take a minute." Daniel agreed and headed toward a private elevator reserved for senior personnel. As the elevator climbed higher and higher, he felt increasingly out of place. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into a world completely different from the one he knew. The floors were polished marble. Expensive artwork lined the walls. Crystal light fixtures reflected soft golden light across every surface. Everything about the floor radiated wealth and power. Daniel adjusted his worn work jacket and followed the signs toward the executive conference room. Through the glass walls, he could see dozens of high-ranking executives seated around an enormous conference table. Investors, attorneys, department heads, and board members quietly discussed financial reports, while assistants moved around preparing materials. At the center of the room sat Victoria Ashton, the 42-year-old CEO of Ashton Global. Her reputation was legendary throughout the company. Intelligent, ambitious, and fiercely demanding, she had transformed the corporation into a billion-dollar empire. Employees admired her success, but feared her temper. Daniel quietly entered the room and approached an assistant standing near the door. He handed over the files and prepared to leave without attracting attention, but as he stepped backward, his heel caught the leg of a chair. He lost his balance for just a fraction of a second. His arm brushed against the edge of the conference table. Several documents slid across the polished surface. Gasps echoed around the room, and then something slipped from Daniel's wrist. The old watch. It struck the marble floor with a sharp metallic crack that instantly silenced the room. Every eye turned toward the object lying on the ground. Daniel's stomach tightened. He immediately bent down to retrieve it, but before he could reach it, another hand moved faster. Victoria Ashton picked up the watch. Holding it delicately between two fingers, she examined the scratched glass and faded leather strap. A small smile appeared on her face. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the smile of someone who had already judged its owner. Daniel felt a knot form in his chest as Victoria slowly looked from the watch to his worn uniform. The room watched in silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And within the next few moments, the simple object Daniel treasured more than anything else would become the center of an event that would shake the entire company and change countless lives forever. Victoria Ashton continued staring at the watch for several seconds, turning it over in her hand as though she had discovered some strange artifact from another era. The silence in the conference room grew heavier with every passing moment. Daniel stood frozen, waiting for her to hand it back. Instead, Victoria let out a soft laugh. A few executives exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should join in. "This is your watch?" she finally asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" A few people around the table chuckled quietly. Daniel felt his face grow warm, but he remained calm. "It's important to me." Victoria looked at the scratched crystal again. "Important?" she repeated. "This thing looks like it came from a bargain bin 30 years ago." More laughter spread through the room. Daniel kept his eyes on the watch. "It was a gift from my wife." For a brief moment, the room became quiet again. Some people expected Victoria to stop there. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair and smiled. "Well, unless your wife was a watchmaker, I doubt this piece of junk has much value." Several board members laughed louder this time, eager to stay on the CEO's good side. Daniel's jaw tightened. He wasn't angry for himself. He was thinking about Mary. Thinking about the promise he had carried for more than 2 decades. "Its value isn't measured by money," Daniel said quietly. Victoria tilted her head. "That's exactly what people say when something has no value." The room erupted with another round of laughter. Daniel felt every eye fixed on him. Years of hard work, sacrifice, and dignity suddenly seemed invisible to everyone around him. To them, he was just a maintenance worker standing in the wrong room. Victoria stood up from her chair and walked toward the large glass wall overlooking the city. Still holding the watch, she examined it one final time. "Tell me something, Mr. Carter," she said. "Do you honestly believe anyone in this room would wear a $10 watch?" Daniel didn't answer. "No," she continued, "because successful people understand the difference between sentimental value and actual value." Daniel slowly extended his hand. "Please give it back." Victoria looked at his outstretched hand, but made no effort to return it. Instead, she glanced around the room. "You know what the problem is?" she asked the executives. "People become emotionally attached to things that should have been thrown away years ago." A few people nodded. Others avoided eye contact. Sarah Mitchell, the company's human resources director, looked visibly uncomfortable. She knew the conversation had crossed a line, but speaking against the CEO could destroy her career. Daniel remained standing. "Please," he said again, "give me my watch." Victoria sighed dramatically. "Fine." For one brief second, Daniel believed she was about to hand it back. Instead, she suddenly tossed the watch across the room. Time seemed to slow. The watch spun through the air. Daniel lunged forward instinctively. He wasn't fast enough. The watch slammed into the edge of a glass display cabinet with a violent crack. The casing shattered. The crystal exploded into fragments. Pieces scattered across the polished marble floor. The sound echoed through the conference room like a gunshot. Silence followed instantly. Complete silence. Daniel stopped moving. His eyes remained fixed on the broken pieces lying across the floor. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody spoke. Even the executives looked stunned by what had just happened. Daniel slowly walked toward the shattered remains and dropped to one knee. His hands trembled as he gathered the fragments one by one. A cracked piece of glass, part of the leather strap, the damaged casing. Each fragment felt like a piece of his past being torn away. Images flooded his mind. Mary smiling in a hospital room, Mary's hand placing the watch into his palm. Mary's final days, her final words. For years, the watch had been the one object connecting him to the woman he had loved more than anything in the world. Now it lay broken at his feet. Across the room, several employees looked away, unable to watch. Sarah Mitchell felt a lump form in her throat. Even some board members appeared ashamed. Yet Victoria simply returned to her chair as if nothing significant had happened. "Someone clean that up," she said casually. Daniel looked up slowly. For the first time, the room saw pain in his eyes. Not anger, not hatred, just heartbreak. He carefully gathered the remaining pieces into his hand and stood. No one stopped him. No one apologized. No one defended him. Without saying another word, Daniel turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, the meeting resumed. Voices returned. Financial projections appeared on screens. The billion-dollar business continued as though nothing had happened, but several people in that room would never forget what they had witnessed. And none of them could have imagined that the broken watch lying in Daniel's pocket contained a secret powerful enough to bring one of the largest corporations in the country to its knees. The events set in motion that morning would soon reach the ears of a man far more powerful than Victoria Ashton, a man who had spent decades searching for something he believed was lost forever. And when he finally learned what had happened to that watch, everything would change. Daniel drove home in complete silence. The broken pieces of the watch rested inside a small cloth pouch on the passenger seat beside him. Every time the truck hit a bump in the road, he could hear the faint sound of metal fragments shifting against one another. It felt like a reminder of what had happened only hours earlier. The humiliation itself didn't hurt nearly as much as the loss. For 24 years, the watch had been more than an object. It had been a promise, a memory, and the last physical connection he had to Mary. By the time he pulled into the driveway of his modest home, the sun was already beginning to set. Daniel sat in the truck for several minutes before finally stepping out. The porch light flickered softly as he approached the front door. Inside, Emily was preparing dinner when she heard him enter. "Dad?" she called from the kitchen. "You're home early." Daniel forced a smile. "Yeah." Emily immediately noticed something was wrong. Her father was normally cheerful, even after difficult days. Tonight, his shoulders seemed heavier. His eyes looked distant. She walked into the living room and froze when she saw the cloth pouch in his hands. "Dad, what happened?" Daniel hesitated. Then he slowly emptied the contents onto the coffee table. Broken glass, bent metal, torn leather. Emily stared at the pieces in disbelief. "The watch?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel quietly told her everything. The boardroom, the laughter, the insults, Victoria Ashton, and finally, the moment the watch shattered against the cabinet, Emily's eyes filled with tears before he even finished. "She did that?" she asked. Daniel nodded again. "In front of everyone." Emily clenched her fists. Anger rushed through her. She wanted to call the company. She wanted to confront the CEO herself, but Daniel simply shook his head. "It's over." Emily looked down at the broken pieces scattered across the table. Then something seemed to occur to her. She quickly stood up and disappeared down the hallway. Moments later, she returned, carrying an old wooden box. Daniel immediately recognized it. It had belonged to Mary. Emily carefully placed it on the table and opened the lid. Inside were letters, photographs, and personal belongings that had been preserved for years. At the very bottom sat a faded envelope with Daniel's name written across the front in Mary's handwriting. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had not seen the envelope in years. Emily picked it up carefully. "Dad, do you remember this?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Your mother told me to keep it safe." Emily handed it to him. "Then maybe it's time to read it again." Daniel opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but Mary's handwriting remained unmistakable. He began reading silently. Halfway through the letter, his expression changed. Emily noticed immediately. "What is it?" Daniel continued reading. His eyes moved faster. Then he stopped. There was one sentence near the bottom of the page that neither of them had thought about in years. "If the day ever comes when you truly need answers," Mary had written, "look inside the watch. There is something hidden there that belongs to your family. Promise me you won't open it unless that day comes." Emily stared at her father. "Inside the watch?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I always thought she meant it symbolically." Emily looked back at the broken pieces on the table. Suddenly, the room felt different. The shattered watch was no longer just a destroyed keepsake. It might contain something neither of them had ever discovered. Carefully, they began examining the damaged pieces. Daniel picked up the cracked casing and turned it over beneath the light. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then Emily noticed a tiny groove hidden along the inner edge of the metal frame. "Dad," she whispered, "look at this." Daniel leaned closer. The groove was almost invisible. It looked like part of the manufacturing design. But when he pressed gently against it, something clicked. A hidden compartment, no larger than a coin, slowly opened inside the casing. Both of them froze. Neither had expected Mary's words to be literal. Daniel carefully reached inside. Hidden within the tiny compartment was a thin metal plate, folded tightly beneath the watch mechanism. He removed it and unfolded it on the table. Etched into the metal were numbers, dozens of numbers. Some looked like account codes. Others appeared to be identification sequences. At the bottom was a name neither of them recognized. Daniel stared at the plate in confusion. "What is this?" Emily shook her head. "I have no idea." But as they continued examining the engraving, one thing became immediately clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't decorative. Someone had hidden this deliberately. And whoever had hidden it had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it remained undiscovered for decades. Daniel looked at the broken watch, then at Mary's letter. Questions flooded his mind. Why had Mary protected this secret? Where had it come from? And most importantly, what was so valuable that it needed to be hidden inside an old $10 watch for more than 30 years? Neither Daniel nor Emily had the answers. Yet hundreds of miles away, in a private medical facility overlooking the ocean, an elderly man named Richard Ashton was about to receive a report concerning an incident involving a maintenance worker, a shattered watch, and a name he had not heard spoken in over 3 decades. The moment he saw that name, his entire world would stop, and the search he thought had ended long ago would begin again. Richard Ashton sat alone in his private recovery suite, overlooking the ocean, surrounded by silence broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. At 78 years old, the founder and chairman of Ashton Global had spent the past several months recovering from heart surgery. His doctors had ordered him to rest, and his daughter Victoria had assured him that the company was running smoothly in his absence. That evening, however, one of his longtime assistants entered, carrying a tablet and a folder of reports. "Sir, there was an incident at headquarters today," the assistant said carefully. Richard barely looked up from his book. "What kind of incident?" he asked. The assistant hesitated before explaining that a maintenance employee had been publicly humiliated during a board meeting and that the CEO herself had thrown and shattered the employee's watch in front of executives, investors. Richard frowned. He disliked arrogance, and he disliked cruelty even more. "Handle it through human resources," he replied. "Normally I would, sir," the assistant answered, "but several executives insisted that you be informed personally." That caught Richard's attention. He slowly placed the book aside. Who was the employee? The assistant handed him the report. Richard adjusted his glasses and glanced at the page. The moment he read the name, all colour seemed to drain from his face. Daniel Carter. His eyes remained fixed on the paper. He read the name again. Daniel Carter. For several long seconds, he didn't move. The assistant watched with growing concern. "Sir?" Richard slowly lowered the report and stared toward the ocean. A memory he had buried for more than 35 years suddenly came rushing back. Rain pouring onto a dark highway. Twisted metal. Shattered glass. Blood. Pain. And a young engineer refusing to leave his side. Michael Carter. Richard could still remember that night with terrifying clarity. Decades earlier, before Ashton Global became a billion-dollar corporation, the company had been on the verge of bankruptcy. Richard had been working around the clock to keep it alive when a terrible car accident nearly ended his life. The doctors had needed blood immediately. Friends disappeared. Business partners vanished. Everyone seemed to abandon him except one man, Michael Carter, a quiet engineer with a modest salary and a family of his own. Without hesitation, Michael donated blood, helped cover emergency expenses, and spent months helping Richard save the struggling company. Richard never forgot what Michael had done. He owed the man everything: his life, his career, his future. Yet before Richard could properly repay him, Michael vanished from company records. Addresses changed, phone numbers stopped working, years passed. Every attempt to locate him failed. Eventually, Richard learned that Michael had died unexpectedly. The guilt remained with him ever since. Now, after more than 3 decades, another Carter had suddenly appeared inside his company. Richard looked down at the report once more. Daniel Carter, age 58. Maintenance department, single father. Then his eyes landed on another note in the incident summary. Witnesses reported that the destroyed watch appeared extremely old and heavily worn. Richard froze. The watch. His breathing slowed. A possibility entered his mind that seemed impossible. Decades ago, before losing contact with Michael Carter, Richard had hidden something inside a watch, something valuable, something important enough to be protected for generations. A promise. The last time he had ever seen it was inside an old watch that Michael carried home. Richard had spent years wondering what became of it. Now his hands began to tremble. "Arrange my plane," he said suddenly. The assistant blinked in surprise. "Sir? I'm returning to headquarters. But your doctors said you shouldn't travel for another month." Richard's voice hardened. "Arrange the plane." The assistant immediately nodded. "Yes, sir." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Daniel and Emily sat at their kitchen table studying the strange metal plate they had discovered inside the shattered watch. Hours had passed since they first opened the hidden compartment. Emily had searched countless databases online, but none of the numbers matched anything she could find. The code seemed to exist nowhere. Daniel carefully rotated the metal plate beneath the light. As he examined it more closely, he noticed something he had missed earlier. Tiny letters were engraved beneath the sequence of numbers. The writing was so small it was almost invisible. Emily leaned forward. "What does it say?" Daniel narrowed his eyes and slowly read the inscription aloud. "Property of Ashton Holdings. Authorized founder access." The room fell silent. Emily stared at her father. Daniel stared back at her. Neither of them understood what they were looking at, but both immediately realized that the secret hidden inside the watch was far bigger than either of them had imagined. This wasn't simply a family keepsake. It was connected to Ashton Global itself. Somewhere beyond their understanding, a secret buried for more than 30 years had begun to resurface. And while Daniel struggled to make sense of the discovery, Richard Ashton was already on his way home, determined to uncover the truth. Neither father nor daughter realized that by this time tomorrow, the entire leadership of Ashton Global would be shaken. The board of directors would be forced into crisis meetings, and Victoria Ashton would discover that the watch she had mocked and destroyed was about to become the most expensive mistake of her life. The following morning, news of Richard Ashton's unexpected return spread through Ashton Global like wildfire. Executives whispered in hallways. Assistants rushed between offices. Board members cancelled meetings and rearranged schedules. No one understood why the 78-year-old founder had suddenly returned despite strict medical orders to remain in recovery. Only Richard knew the truth. The moment his private jet landed, he headed directly to headquarters without stopping at his office or speaking to the media. His first command stunned everyone. "Bring Daniel Carter to me immediately." Within an hour, Daniel found himself standing outside the chairman's private conference room, completely unaware of what was happening. When the doors opened, he stepped inside and saw Richard Ashton waiting for him. The elderly chairman looked at Daniel for several long moments before speaking. Then, his eyes drifted toward the broken watch resting on the table. His expression changed instantly. Richard slowly reached for the damaged pieces, his hands trembling as he examined them. When he finally saw the hidden metal plate Daniel had discovered, tears began forming in his eyes. Daniel and Emily, who had accompanied her father, exchanged confused glances. Richard carefully sat down before looking directly at Daniel. "Your father was Michael Carter, wasn't he?" Daniel froze. Very few people ever mentioned his father anymore. "Yes," he replied quietly. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. "Then I've spent 35 years searching for your family." The room fell silent. Over the next hour, Richard told them everything. The accident, the company crisis, the sacrifices Michael Carter had made to save both Richard's life and Ashton Global. Then, he revealed the secret hidden inside the watch. Decades earlier, Richard had created a special founder's equity certificate tied to a protected block of company ownership. He had hidden the access credentials inside the watch as a symbol of gratitude and intended to formally transfer the shares to Michael when circumstances allowed. But before he could complete the process, they lost contact forever. Nobody had ever claimed the ownership. Nobody had ever known it existed until now. Richard ordered the company's legal department and financial officers to verify the records immediately. What they discovered shocked everyone. The founder's shares had remained untouched for more than 3 decades. With the company's growth, mergers, and stock appreciation, their value had grown beyond anyone's imagination. By current valuation, the ownership stake was worth more than $120 million. The room fell completely silent. Daniel could hardly process the number. Emily covered her mouth in disbelief. But the biggest shock was still to come. Later that afternoon, Richard called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. Every executive attended. So did Victoria Ashton. She entered the room confidently, unaware of what was about to happen. Richard sat at the head of the table. Daniel and Emily were seated beside him. The atmosphere felt tense from the moment the meeting began. Richard stood slowly and held up the broken watch. "Does anyone recognize this?" he asked. No one answered. Then he turned toward Victoria. "You do." Victoria's confidence immediately faded. Richard proceeded to reveal the entire story. He spoke about Michael Carter's sacrifice. He explained the hidden ownership. He described the promise he had made decades earlier. Every word seemed to make the room quieter. Victoria's face grew pale as realization set in. She looked toward Daniel and finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. The man she had publicly humiliated was not just a maintenance worker. He was the son of the man who had saved her father's life, the rightful owner of a massive founder's stake in the company. The board members sat speechless. Some lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Others stared at Victoria in disbelief. Then came the moment nobody would ever forget. Richard slowly walked around the table and stopped in front of Daniel. Hundreds of employees were watching through a live company broadcast. Executives, managers, and staff across multiple offices watched in stunned silence. Richard looked directly at Daniel before lowering himself to his knees. Gasps echoed throughout the room. No one could believe what they were seeing. The founder of a billion-dollar corporation was kneeling before a maintenance worker. Tears filled Richard's eyes. "I failed your father," he said, "and I failed your family. I promised that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Yet because of my failure, you were treated with disrespect in the company he helped save. For that, I am deeply sorry." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Emily began crying openly. Even many executives struggled to hold back emotion. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Daniel stepped forward and gently helped Richard back to his feet. "My father never helped people because he wanted something in return," Daniel said quietly. "He helped because it was the right thing to do." Richard nodded, unable to speak. As for Victoria, she sat frozen in her chair. The weight of her actions finally became impossible to ignore. Days later, she publicly apologized to Daniel and voluntarily stepped away from her position while the board reviewed her leadership. For the first time in her life, she began learning that respect could not be measured by wealth, status, or appearances. Daniel eventually accepted ownership of the shares, but he refused to let money change who he was. He established scholarships in the names of both his parents, funded programs for working families, and continued living with the humility that had always defined him. Several months later, the restored watch sat once again on his wrist. The cracks had been repaired. The mechanism worked perfectly. One evening, Daniel sat on his porch, watching the sunset, while Emily laughed nearby. He glanced down at the watch and gently touched its worn surface. In that moment, he thought about Mary. He thought about his father. He thought about the years of struggle that had led him here. A soft smile appeared on his face. The watch had never truly been worth $10. Its value had always been hidden where no one thought to look. And in the end, the same was true of the man who wore it. The world had judged him by what was visible, but his true worth had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be revealed.
Thank you for watching my video.